I usually try to state something of interest at the start of these videos, then meaningfully segue into the game, but I got nothing this time around. I did Hand of Fate 1 in 2015, you should probably go and watch that for context if you know nothing about the series. That being said, let us see what the sequel has to offer. Hand of Fate's core is still unchanged. It hybridized old adventure books a la Fighting Fantasy, basic minigames a la Cups with Cards, a counter-based combat system a la Arkham Asylum, and a deck building system a la deck building systems. Obviously some, none, or all of these elements might appeal to you, but the strength of the game is in how it manages to combine them into a singular experience. Your journeys through cities, catacombs, and castles are made engaging by the alert change of pace in terms of content. Sometimes you fight, sometimes you dodge, and sometimes you roll a die. Since this is a sequel, each of these base elements got a big makeover, but the question is, has the overall experience improved? After all, the phrase better than the sum of its parts implies that just stringing together good standalone elements is not enough. How they combine with each other is key. Let us start with a place that is objectively changed in positive ways, the gambits. Previously, there was only one where 4 cards were shuffled and the player had to guesstimate which ones were good, since while you can follow the cards when they were moved around, it was quite difficult past the second shuffle. In Hand of Fate 2, there are another 3 such challenges in addition. Dice in which the player must hit a target number by rolling 3 die then picking which ones to reroll, Spin Wheel which involves stopping a circle made of cards at the right moment, and the purely reaction-oriented affair wherein the player must stop a pendulum of light so as to hit specific blocks. While none can be described as particularly engaging in the long term due to their simplicity, their merit is that of variety. Hand of Fate 1, having only the card shuffle minigame, made it wear out its welcome sooner than the game's content lasted. But I'm happy to say that these 4 gambits combined together managed to outshine the previous iteration completely. I particularly like how they vary in terms of luck to skill ratio. The pendulum reaction game is pure skill but quite stressful, while the dice game is almost pure luck but quite undemanding of the player. I've never seen Hand of Fate has something particularly hardcore worth spending hundreds of hours on, but I can see some players getting frustrated with a more luck-based challenge if they decide to strive towards system mastery. With that in mind, I think the overall package of these gambits is competently designed to accommodate the pace of the game as presented by 22 scenarios. These scenarios represent the greatest change in terms of structure that the sequel has done. In the original, every map was more or less a short dungeon crawl that ended with a boss, while various modifiers were applied to spice things up. Hand of Fate 2 goes for adventures, narratively contextualized travels with twists and turns that reverberate in gameplay. Your character helps stop the assassination of a man by conversing with 3 potential suspects and having to solve a simple logic puzzle, or they play a very basic turn-based strategy game, of all things, to deal with an invasion of Nordic warriors. You can see how the developers try to go with a variety of goals rather than a straightforward gradient of similar content. Added to the mix is a surprising amount of lore? Yes, Hand of Fate now has a story, or rather world building to go along with it. Apparently this whole shtick of fighting and moving across cards is called the game of life and death, and whoever wins shall influence the world. A century has passed since the protagonist of the previous game, retroactively named Kalas, has won, and the world has certainly felt his touch. A genocidal empire spans the land and they exterminate everything magical and non-human. It actually explains and sometimes even directly addresses why the enemies from the previous game are little more than legend. Your character finds himself stripped of his memories and forced to play a sort of training version of the game of life and death with the dealer from Hand of Fate 1, back from the dead and seemingly acting as your mentor. This setup is much more conducive to the diverse adventures that Hand of Fate 2 takes the player along, with a narrative thread to keep the ball rolling between them. However, there is a sticking point that I feel affects the entirety of the experience. Hand of Fate is a hybrid which works best when keeping its gameplay elements varied but consistently paced, and the first part of this game does this well. The ratio of combat to gambits, the ratio of combat length to combat encounters, and the rate at which new enemy sets are introduced makes everything feel fresh.
Here we come to the end of the beginning, running errands for mages. This will become a theme, I dare say.
Unfortunately, the second half misses the point entirely by making the scenarios aggressively focused on a few gameplay elements at a time. When the game starts throwing long combat scenarios back to back or never-ending gambits, everything that makes Hand of Fate 2 engaging disappears. You are no longer dealing with a diverse set of relatively simple systems, but rather going through a gauntlet of subpar elements, arranged one after the other, but also feeling distinctly separated. This isn't helped at all by the length of the later scenarios that can go anywhere from 30 minutes to 1 hour long, especially since deck building plays such a huge role in how a scenario works out. So restarting 40 minutes in with newfound knowledge after your first try feels more like you are being lied to rather than personal failure. Here's an example. A difficult challenge called The Star tells you that you should add life replenishing cards in your deck. While not exactly untruthful, it is a lie by omission. What the scenario actually entails is a multitude of curse cards that cause the loss of life points in the first place. So after losing horribly the first time around, you stack your deck with curse removal counter cards and suddenly things become manageable. Nay, they actually become easy. Too easy. This is a problem that Hand of Fate 2 suffers over and over again in its latter half. You get trounced due to not knowing the challenge the first time around, then you adapt your deck with newfound knowledge and breeze through the encounter. It is like a pendulum swing when it comes to the pacing of its difficulty, only getting it just right at the start of the game. I will say that there is a band-aid fix of sorts to this problem in the form of card rewarding challenges that are completed both by finishing the scenario and fulfilling certain secondary objectives. So replayability is encouraged, but this feels more like a consolation prize since it doesn't fix that pendulum-like difficulty that a deck building balance causes in the long run. To be fair, the longer length could be justified if the combat system is an engaging affair, since it could be considered the most preeminent minigame in the whole package. Is it any good? Have the developers managed to make their simple take on the Arkham combat more palatable? Sadly, I have to say it is a one step forward, two step backward sort of a situation. Polish is obvious from the get-go, animations flow better into one another, enemies don't do that obvious holding back anymore to give the player time to block, and in general, hitting stuff feels more rewarding. There have also been some minor positive complexities introduced. Each weapon now has a special attack that requires keeping up hit combos without taking damage to activate. A much needed system change in my opinion, since it rewards players' skill within the context of each individual combat scenario. Weapons are now also divided into 3 categories: sword and board, two-handed, and double dagger. They govern what attacks the player can block or riposte, and they have different enough animation sets that cycling through them feels meaningfully different. I wouldn't call this variety exciting by any means, but it does the job given that each weapon set enforces slightly different restrictions versus the enemy types. This works well in tandem with a new companion system, non-player entities that have their own health bar and open up an extra companion-specific move, such as a magic bubble that protects against a single blow or a charge that stuns the enemies. I'm glad that they decided to make them a non-stressful addition to the player's moveset, since if they get knocked out, only a simple button press in their vicinity revives them to full health. Having to look after them during each combat probably wouldn't have been very engaging. I say this since there is a new mission type where other allies appear and they function the same as companions, only you need to ensure their survival. It isn't particularly interesting since it involves more pushing enemies back away to make sure none of your allies die, rather than full-on fighting the enemy. Beyond that, there is also one change that simply makes no sense: the armor bash mechanic. Some enemies have armor which needs to be brought down with a bash attack. What this means in practice is that the enemies have a different type of health bar that needs to be brought down with a specific attack button. Afterwards, their regular health bar shows up and that needs to be brought down with a regular attack button. It is an added bit of complexity that creates no depth. It could have been easily cut without affecting the experience in any way. It just means more buttons to press for no reason other than an arbitrary meter. I genuinely think this might have been a feature that they didn't manage to cut in time and it stuck around in the release version since they had bigger issues to tackle. Maybe they plan on expanding it in future patches. Who knows? In any case, the developers clearly try to improve the combat by adding minor systemic changes with the intention of keeping the variety up, which is the obvious way to go from Hand of Fate 1 to Hand of Fate 2. Unfortunately, all of these welcome improvements are counterbalanced by some new and terrible flaws. The most noticeable, and noticeably the worst, is just how damn slow it is. The number of enemies plus their health has taken a serious jump up in value, most likely to compensate for the fact that they are now controlled by an obvious herd-like AI, never attacking with more than 2 enemies at the same time and just generally moving in this blob-like formation. The result is that the combat becomes tedious incredibly quick. The first few hours are fine, but when the back-to-back combat I described earlier hits, and you have this mass of enemies that crowds the screen, the game just falls apart. This is a far cry from the original that wasn't shy about throwing you into tight arenas with enemies constantly jumping you with a combination of blockable, unblockable, and ranged attacks. I mean, it was still the Arkham Horror counter-based combat, but you needed to react on the fly, and given the low HP values on both sides, things ended pretty quick, for better or worse. Hand of Fate 2 also decided to move the camera closer to the character, and given the higher enemy count, the incidence of you saying "what the hell happened" is much higher, because the attack indicators are red and green, and guess what colors are prominently featured in some enemies' color palettes. This is an especially egregious offense in situations like fighting the corrupted enemy type in a sewer location. The indicator, the enemies, and the environment all prominently feature green in their color scheme. Not exactly stellar feedback. There is also this annoying habit of animation locking in regards to feedback. When breaking armor or executing a foe, the animation cannot be cancelled and the player is immune to damage. However, the hot damage feedback is still active, meaning you will find yourself confronted with red edges on your screen without actually taking any damage. This is bad. It's the kind of thing that serious fine-tuning doesn't miss, especially in a sequel that seems to focus on polish above all. And finally, what happened to the environmental interactions? They are completely absent from the combat scenarios, and they played an important role regarding dynamism, since enemies, as well as you, could be affected by them. This was one of the areas that I felt Hand of Fate had its best chance of putting its own spin on the counter-based combat system, and thus have a bit of uniqueness to it. Instead, it's completely out the window, and Hand of Fate 2 is all the worse for it. Even the environmental specific levels feel like simplistic prototypes compared to the more challenging mazes that the original threw at you from time to time. All in all, I am frankly shocked by how the combat in the sequel turned out. It is longer, easier, bloated, and thus more boring. I don't understand how they went from short, high lethality combat encounters to these mashing slogfests that kill the pacing. And for a game about balancing different short bursts of simplistic gameplay, pacing is the end-all be-all. I sincerely wasn't expecting this type of devolution, because the original Hand of Fate already seemed pretty bare bones, so improvements would be abound and easy to implement. Apparently not. Speaking of unexpected devolution, the atmosphere of the table overworld is also a weird step backwards. The camera is tilted to the left side, so you're no longer face to face with the dealer, and the table simply isn't as animated. It is nice that day and night change, but where are the elements like the spider? In the original, there was an arachnid critter scurrying about, making the table feel more alive, and even the dealer had more fidgety animations. Here the table is static, and the dealer is this morose, stoic figure that comments from time to time. In Hand of Fate 1, he was far more incisive and spiteful with his commentary, mostly mocking you, but sometimes breaking the fourth wall or languishing in bouts of self-hatred about how the game has consumed him. In Hand of Fate 2, there's none of that.
Water is a symbol for the many thoughts that churn beneath the surface. What is it you're thinking of? What concern is worrying at your mind?
That being said, there is a story reason for this. I have two issues here. First is that this style of game doesn't allow for deep characterization. It is a what you see is what you get sort of affair, and it worked really well in the previous game with this character. So bringing back the dealer in a more jaded, complex form is simply ineffective, since you don't have the means to explore this deeper take on the character. Thus, you only remain with a surface detail, which feels more like my bored high school geography teacher than a mystical mentor back from the dead. As for the second point, the narrative justification does not live up in any way. The idea is that some of the last remaining mages in the world gather to invoke the dealer back from the dead so he can stop the previous game's protagonist and end his crusade against all things supernatural. The new protagonist is fated to fight the former, so to this end, the dealer decides to train him for what is to come. That is the framing of Hand of Fate 2. You are playing a training version of the card game so you can be ready to fight the hero from Hand of Fate 1. This is all fine and dandy. I appreciate how the game changing is something acknowledged and represented in the world building, and I think the narrative thread is fine, it gets the job done, boring dealer notwithstanding. However, the climax completely fails. You reach the final scenario and confront Calax, to which he says,
"Well, here we are, at our final meeting. You expect me to play cards? No, I have devoted my life to battle. And battle it shall be!"
What was the point of this entire game? Why was it necessary to forget and relearn everything in the form of a training exercise if the final guy just wants to brawl? This sequence retroactively relegates everything that the story tried to accomplish before to nothingness. It's borderline insulting to the player. Beyond that, there are 2 endings with incredibly minor changes based on how many scenario tokens you have unlocked. Not much to say, honestly. So overall, the story focus doesn't pay off, and Hand of Fate 2 is a worse game for it. Sadly. The last thing I want to mention before wrapping up is the notable delay of Endless Mode. I actually postponed this review a bit in the hopes that it will be added, but nearly 2 months after release it is still a no-show. I can't help but feel that this impacted the game massively in a negative way. Don't get me wrong, I didn't find the previous game's Endless Mode to be that great, but the opportunity to unlock everything and then use it together in a single run is something that would have put a nice finish on the experience. It will most likely get added at some point, but by then it might be too little too late. That is Hand of Fate 2, warts and all. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy playing this game, but the sheer amount of missteps when it comes to improving the formula is disheartening. Like I said, 1 step forward, 2 steps backwards. In fact, after replaying it a bit, I'm gonna say that I prefer the first one. It is less polished but a much more cohesive experience in the end. Though I am sure that is not what the developers want to hear, especially given how much room for improvement there was. I guess failure is always an option, no matter how unseemly. Whatever Defiant Development decides to do next, I want to believe it will be pulled off with flair because they are talented and I am sure they have at least one really good game in them. I can only hope to see more and better from them.